Welcome back to Tuesday Morning Pastor's Corner. This is episode 2 of our roundtable discussion on biblical masculinity. Last time we talked over the confusion in our culture and also within our churches about what it means to be a man. So if you'd like to go back and watch that first episode, probably be well worth it, at least kind of get some background information. Now we're going to talk about how to decide what biblical masculinity is. And so we'll begin with the first question. It's kind of an open question for anyone who'd like to answer. And if you don't talk a whole lot over the hour, I'm going to go ahead and call on you. So feel free to go ahead and express all your thoughts, your ideas. Hopefully you kind of reviewed some of the information, and we'll be able to have a good, solid discussion on both the passages in Mark and also some passages in Genesis. But obviously, we know who the ultimate man is. And I'll ask this question this way. Is Jesus a proper role model, not just for, I would say, Christianity, although I'm using that term very loosely, but for masculinity, and why or why not?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's an unquestionable reality that being the perfect man, the only one to truly ever satisfy God's righteousness, of course, because he is God of very God as well, that we look to him to understand. And I'd say we'd have a far better time coming to meaningful observations about what masculinity is all about, by looking at him than we would by looking at our culture or some other ridiculous source that we might find to self-define these terms, because it's God's creation. So to me, I see Jesus Christ as the unquestioned pinnacle of that picture. And as we said last week, that doesn't necessarily mean that those things are not necessary for a godly woman. I mean, a godly man is, first of all, a godly person. So when we're looking at those things that are common, it can be easy to overlook, because a crummy person will not be a good man from God's perspective.
Yeah, right. I like that a lot. Anybody else have some thoughts on Jesus Christ being the ultimate example of biblical masculinity?
I would definitely agree with that. But I think it's worth considering too the build up to Jesus Christ. Looking at scripture from a progressive or incremental revelation standpoint, we see a developing story, and it culminates in the perfect man, Jesus Christ. And it really, I think, contextualizes our default or our basis, to put it in Brad's vernacular, our crumminess comes from that context. And so in light of that crumminess, we then have the perfect example in Christ, and not to mention all the spiritual truths for the believer of our positional identity in Christ that we're to operate out of for our practical living.
I picture a lot of the questions that would probably revolve around Jesus Christ and masculinity, kind of like what we discussed last week. And Brad, you touched on it already. Jesus displays the proper humanity, 100%. So, and without getting into a whole lot of, back and forth, because we're going to be talking more about Jesus Christ over the weeks, but specifically within Jesus, is there an understanding of masculinity, not just humanity? In other words, he's the best person, and all overall his examples. But is there something specific within Jesus Christ's life or in his words that displays something masculine as opposed to simply just human? As probably as
I think Paul played very heavily into this in Ephesians chapter 5, as he's talking about the relationship between Christ and the church as a husband and wife, or a bride and bridegroom relationship. He associates Christ with the bridegroom, with the husband. And so even in that sense, the way that he loved and the way that he led is an example for biblical masculinity. In fact, absolutely so much so that he equates, again, Christ with the church, and the church with the bride, or Christ with the husband, and the church with the bride or the wife. So I think that we could say that Paul was taking that exact principle over and trying to place it even to the church context. And thus, if that is a good illustration that Paul used, which we'd be inclined to say it is, then I think we can, take some pretty confident steps forward on that and say that Christ offers us something special in regard to our perspective on masculinity as well.
Would you say then that the ultimate masculine trait is self-sacrifice?
I don't know. I've never said that before, but I sure am comfortable with the statement. I love it. That's definitely not mine, but that's tremendous.
I want to add a
Especially,
couple.
go for it.
Just a couple things, because I want to bounce off that idea of servanthood. First of all, I believe the two main things Christ focused on in his life. Now, first of all, we're dealing with a loaded statement.
Yes,
How could Christ not be the perfect male? Not is Christ the perfect male, but how could he not be? It's like a kid came up to me a few weeks ago and asked, was Christ a good citizen? Or basically she said, is Jesus a good citizen? Now, how could he not be a good citizen? Even though we look at things and people will say, well, he did this and that wasn't well, he's perfect in all aspects. Let's start with that. But he came to serve and pay and basically pay a ransom for us all. And he showed that service in John 13. He served, he put others first. Along with that, he loved, like Brad alluded to in Ephesians 5, which is an entirely hard thing for most males. It's a willingness to put others first. And I think that's what happens to a lot of males. They don't start, I'm willing to serve you, and I'm willing to love you, and I'm willing to put others first. And the heck with my boat and my golf clubs. You guys know what I'm saying. I want to put you first. Not that you can't do those things. It's just set your priorities. I always talk to most of the guys I deal with about setting priorities. What's important? What is it, what you're doing in life, again, to glorify God, but is it service to others? Is it willingness to love? Starts with God, starts with your family, your wife. So if I put it in a nutshell, what is Christ's example of masculinity? His servanthood, his love. That's how, in a nutshell. I mean, we can grow that throughout this whole thing to a much greater scale. But I also think I'm going to add this, because I'm just dealing with this. This is just me being funny. That's all. Christ's willingness to shut up when he needs to shut up, and not just talk himself into a ditch. Thank you, Eric.
Far more difficult than it sounds, right? I need to grow in that.
Yes.
But you could take Philippians 2:5.
Yeah.
To have this attitude in yourselves is also in Christ Jesus, and you go through we can do the doctrine of kenosis and spend weeks on that, but it all boils down to the fact he was unselfish, he was humble, and he was sacrificial. I think you can extract those three qualities out of that easily. And then Ephesians 5 backs that up. To love your wife as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. I mean, I think we got some pretty clear mandates as men that if we could ever get those right, we'd be pretty good shape.
Yeah, I think that's one of the major concepts that we've kind of explored, and I think we'll continue to develop over the weeks, is that one of the hallmarks of masculinity is a combination, and one of the points I wanted to bring out about Jesus Christ and his life is not just the self-sacrifice, although it's there, and the humility, but being able to lead with that mental attitude, because he led the 12 and hundreds, maybe, we don't know the exact number, but hundreds, if not thousands more, as he was going throughout and giving instructions and helping people out. But he led with strength while being humble and self-sacrificial. And I think that the human nature is that if you're going to lead, you have to limit the self-sacrifice, because otherwise you're letting other people lead. You're letting the other people win. And so I think that's something that we need to develop over the time. But before
also, it's worth it. I'm sorry to intrude on you here, but I think it's worth making a note that I think we've confused self-sacrifice with almost a wimpiness, a niceness, right? And realizing that it is, self-sacrificing, at least for me, it is self-sacrificing to confront someone who's got a poor idea or a wrong idea or a selfish idea. It is self-sacrifice, because it'd be far easier for me as a low confrontation person, whether you believe that or not about me. But as a person who's not doesn't enjoy conflict by any stretch of the imagination, I've learned as a leader in the church that it's more self-sacrificing. It takes more sacrifice for me to, stand up and put someone down who needs to be put down, of course, or set them down, not like a dog, but like make sure that they get dealt with, because I'd far rather take the passive role. And I think that's a huge temptation in unfulfilled masculinity, is to take a passive role, right? To not take an active role, to not get involved, because it's far easier for us to get involved and let the women take care of it, right? So I think that your very important point that is so valid and valuable is that self-sacrifice is not always to be demurring and put others' desires or wrong ideas. Self-sacrifice is constantly doing what's best for everyone else, which means clinging to the biblical interpretation.
But I think the word gentle has been misunderstood, because gentle to me is power under control. That's a gentle man was one who is powerful yet controlled. And when Jesus in Matthew 11:29, one of the few places that he ever talked about himself, I am meek and gentle of heart. Okay, that's one of the few places he ever addresses anything about his psychology, if you will, his attitude about things. But he was, sustaining the universe and was still gentle. He was able to be gentle with those he came in contact with.
Compassionate.
Yeah.
Loving.
I would like to, if I may, to go back to say something that Brad said, because I'm wholeheartedly in agreement with that. When you talk about self-sacrifice, the self-sacrifice has to be to accomplish that which is in the best interest of another individual in light of eternity's values. And so that can require a whole bunch of different things from you. Like Brad said, that may mean stepping forward and taking a role that would be very opposite for a person. So when I think about self-sacrifice, I have to think, what's in that person's best interest? I'm sacrificing for what? If I don't pull that into my concept of my sacrifice, then I'm not expressing love either. Because I'm pretty, and I've said that to you, Eric, I'm pretty comfortable with my understanding of love, including making you sacrificing for the real needs. And that's something else I think you have to determine when you talk about making self-sacrifice for somebody. I'm making the sacrifice for the real needs of that person and for what's in the best interest of that person in light of eternity's values. That's where the sacrifice comes in. And that does require something. There's a presupposition when I make that statement. And the presupposition is I know what's in somebody's best interest in light of eternity's values. And that only comes from knowledge of the truth of the word.
Next question.
One other thing for a question, if we're dealing with these things, I think when we talk about the characteristics of a positive, healthy male masculinity, I think one thing you have to keep in mind, and I think this is the most difficult of the things to keep in mind, I look at those much in the same way I look at the attributes of God, and his attributes are kept in, if you will, there's a perfect tension within God and his attributes. And I think of that tension, I used to play stringed instruments. And I think of the tension like a stringed instrument. If the stringed instrument's tension is not perfect, then the tune that you play is not going to be perfect. And so I think the real challenge is once you identify the attributes that should be common, then the real challenge is to keep those in as close to perfect tension as you can. I'm thankful God keeps his in perfect tension. I would be frightened to death of the omnipotence of God if it were not for the holiness, the righteousness, the justice, the love of God, the rest of those attributes cause all that. That's what I mean by keeping things in tension.
If we're too comfortable, then it becomes problematic. If we're not in fearful respect of God the Father, then at times, we can demean his holiness, focusing on his mercy, his love, his grace. So, Jacob, you wanted to add? Carl kind of phased out a little bit.
I think just developing on what both Drew and Carl are saying, I want to say I heard this from Chuck Swindoll. Sounds like a Chuck Swindoll thing, but in talking about meekness, he said it's power under control, and he uses the illustration of a wild Mustang being broken and tamed. That power, the great power, it's still there. It's just under control. And so I think that, perhaps another major tenet of what biblical masculinity involves is self-control. And, correlating that with, as we kind of maybe start to look at Mark chapter 3, but really any of Jesus's dealings with the religious leaders, the sharp contrast that the gospel writers seem to present is that they are the worthless shepherds that are often mentioned in Israel's history in the Old Testament. The first century was certainly that way. And Christ, as the shepherd, demonstrates that meek, self-controlled leadership that came to serve others, not assuming the low position because he is indeed lowly, but assuming the low position because of that's the quality that perhaps we should consider as more manly than the guy that can win a fist fight or whatever it might be.
And I'm pretty sure if Jesus wanted to, not just obviously because he's God, but in his prowess, his job, his physical stature, I'm pretty sure he could handle himself physically.
Well, his go-to move would be to just touch the hip and dislodge the hip socket.
He was wrestling.
I always thought he might take that sheep over his shoulders and turn it into kind of a laser cat.
Well, you think about it. I mean, why was he not prevented physically from basically chasing out the money changers if he was not imposing?
That's a good point.
Why was he not just pushed aside by the Pharisees if he was not able to stand up and present? One of the things that you learn, and again, a lot of the times it's not just the traits of a man, but anyone can do this. Learning how to present yourself in a room and how to carry yourself in your room so that you have a commanding presence. You're actually taught that in law enforcement, and then so you're kind of like, hey, listen, if you walk into a room and you're not commanding. If people don't notice you, you're not going to be a good police officer. Why? Because you're going to go, oh, guys, stop it. People are going to ignore you. They're going to push you aside. So the fact that when he speaks in a synagogue or in a temple environment, and then he gains the attention, is not simply because he's the God of the universe, but because within himself as a man, he is able to get their attention and be able to have that presence by how he carries himself, the way he speaks, the way that he able to command the room. And I think that's something that we could also, as men, with our families or even within our responsibilities, learn from him as well. I do want to move the conversation along. I know I said that we were going to use Brad's book as a launching pad. I basically condensed the questions of all the different references he had in dealing with simply the question of how can we learn from Jesus. So, but I want to ask this question before moving on to the second chapter as a launching pad. How, other than Jesus, because obviously we could study Jesus and Christology and especially with the angle of masculinity. Other than Jesus, how do we understand biblical masculinity? Is there just can we go ahead and give a broad kind of a thought there, especially for our audience? If there's people watching this, we want to be able to kind of give them other information.
my go-to starting point apart from Jesus, and I would always start with Christ just because he's such the pinnacle, is to go to Genesis 1 and 2, and which we spoke about at great length last time. But it seems that the things that God gave Adam to do, and those primary tasks revolving around our stewardship of the earth, putting things in order, categorizing things, labeling things, making things make sense, to ourselves, and then bringing order from disorder are all parts of the ways in which we're made after the image of God. And then additionally, the relationship to Eve is another important part of masculinity, whether or not you're married, right? The idea of, honoring, cherishing women or those who are physically weak or in any kind of a vulnerable position, to desire to protect, to care for, to look after, and to again show honor and glory and cherish the feminine. So one of the most important things that I believe masculinity is meant to do from the very beginning is to lift up and bring femininity, bring women to their ultimate place in God's plan and their ultimate part in God's plan. So that would be my second stop if I were, just going to throw someone at something.
Which we're going to get there right after this. So other than Jesus Christ in Genesis, because that's actually the topic of the next conversation, other than Jesus Christ in Genesis, if you wanted to kind of give other statements about where do you go, Brad should know it's in his book. That's chapter 2. Where else do you go other than, than Jesus Christ? Is there? I guess I kind of have a thought in my own question. So I'm kind of curious if you have any thoughts on this before we move to Genesis and kind of make some observations. So do you have any other thoughts about where you learn masculinity, biblical masculinity, from that perspective? Do you have any other ideas?
Is that to all or Brad?
Oh,
I think what I like to look at is all the men of God in Scripture. Looking at the Abrahams, the Noahs, the Moseses, the Joshua, and just seeing, okay, Christ is the ultimate picture, but these men, dealing with much of the same, maybe a little bit different. They didn't have the indwelling Holy Spirit, but they did have the Spirit's power working in them at certain times. But just looking at them and looking at their failures, also looking at the qualities that Scripture underscores as remarkable and worth our attention. And I think we can glean a lot from that.
Okay, in my notes, I basically wrote that down as the descriptives with their history and the narratives, and also within some of the other writings about the character of a man. So we're getting the descriptions that I think we can properly deduce what is the proper aspects of those characteristics and what are the negatives. So I think that's good. Are there prescriptions about masculinity in the Bible?
I think the principle of walking by faith is a good one.
Is that, again, again, I don't want to be pedantic, although I know I am. I know that I can, I could be very but I do want to make a distinction between good human and man. In other words, what are the distinctions, or where can we go other than Jesus Christ and creation? We'll get to creation because I think it's a great launching point, and we're going to get to these other places. I just kind of want to give out there to the people who only watch 1 or 2 episodes. Where can we go to be able to understand what is the role of a man as opposed to the role of a good Christian woman? Is there places we can go? Is there either a passage that sticks out of your mind, or is there a particular concept that you want to kind of disclose?
Another one is Abraham and Sarah's relationship. Not always as a positive example, but I think we very frequently see what happens when Abraham fulfills his leadership role in a sacrificial way, and what happens when he fails to fulfill those expectations. You mentioned the word prescription. That sounds difficult to me only because in my mind, prescription is a take this every day, do this every day, to which Jacob's excellent advice to walk by means of the Spirit, to walk spiritually,
Mhm.
however we want to talk
Yes.
about that, is certainly a part of it, and is the key part, in fact, the ultimate part. But I think for me, examining the relationship between Abraham and Sarah is one of those places that makes it very easy. In fact, every time I do marriage counseling, we try to talk about Abraham and Sarah, because it shows what happens when men abdicate leadership, when they bow to cultural customs, like, hey, we can't have kids, so let's do this thing with the surrogate, that was totally unacceptable from God's perspective, but was culturally absolutely acceptable. So it shows what happens when men abdicate in their relationship to cultural expectations, when they abdicate in relationship to their wife's leadership. And that doesn't mean that men should never take advice from their wife or take their wife's course of action, what she sees as being correct. It means that whatever choice he makes as the leader, he fully commits to, and he doesn't go back on, well, that was your stupid idea. But he says that, no, I mean, I listened to you as my chief source of wisdom and intelligence outside of the Bible, right? And we decided to do that together, right? I decided as the leader. I'm not panning that off on you and saying, hey, she's your maidservant, do what you want with her, right? It takes responsibility for everything.
Jacob?
Yeah, and just dealing with the question of prescriptive, I can't think of a specific passage or narrative that perfectly demonstrates that, but just thinking in terms of the divine institution of family, and as that theme develops, especially in Israel, with the giving of the law and then the command prescription for them to teach their children, I think that has some touch points with what it is as a man and my responsibility to lead my family. And so that kind of is a more general prescription, I think. And of course, we would need to slightly modify it for our dispensational responsibilities.
Absolutely. All right. So going on to Genesis, and Brad, you already kind of touched on this, but I'll ask the question anyway, just kind of for the entire group. And Brad, of course, if you want to add more to your thoughts. And again, I want to try to be clear about this, because obviously we want to make sure that we all are good people. What does creation tell us about, in specifics, about masculinity, about being a man, in the creation account? And I'm thinking not just I'm going to go ahead and try to limit down to chapters 1 and 2. I think chapter 3 has other questions that we have to deal with. Not everybody speak at once. Go ahead, Drew. I could see it.
Well, obviously he made them different. and he
Yes.
made them to fit together. I mean, that's the way he did. So, but male and female are different physically, but I think they're also different soulishly. They just see things different. Not that either one is right or wrong, but that they're just different. And that's, I think, hard for people to understand. You were in law enforcement, and I went through a course long time ago. They said, whenever you're trying to figure out about a hit and run accident, you ask the man what kind of car it was, and you ask the woman what color it was, because their answers are two different things based on what they see. Not that either one of them was wrong. And so I think that God put the man there to fill the earth, subdue it, rule over, etc. And so I think that's his God-given role. And I think biblical masculinity is the courage to do what God has called you to do. Okay. And then do it. Then we can nuance it in a lot of different ways. But I think when you look at Noah build an ark, okay, so he did. You look at Abraham, leave the land of your relatives, and he did. And that's you find Moses, hey, go lead these people out of Egypt, and reluctantly he did. But I mean, there's still that courage to do what God has called you to do. And I think that's got a big part of masculinity, because you're fighting the world, the flesh, and the devil all along the way.
In regards to the biblical mandate of Adam in the garden, I is the mandate to cultivate, to care for, have dominion over. Do we see that as a mandate to Adam, or a mandate to Adam and Eve? And have you asked that question? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's a mandate to both, but the authority or headship is carried by Adam. So it's something that's executed with both. Both are required to fulfill it. But that's the curious thing. Sometimes we have to correct thinking in our society that man is only the head because Eve is the one who sinned. Well, from my standpoint, it seems clear that Adam was the one standing there the whole time and allowing everything to transpire, using her as kind of the guinea pig. Hey, what's going to happen? And then, so I think his sin is greater, whereas she was deceived. He deliberately disobeyed. And so, point being, headship's not a result of the fall. It was a part of creation. God made man first and woman out of man. So
what is headship? And since we're on that topic,
And I think, that pointing out that there's a physical nature of headship, that Adam was created first. Adam was the one who was given the mandate from God. He was meant to, it seems, communicate that to Eve. So that shows another part of masculinity that is implicit within the Genesis account, is that he is designed to get his orders from God and bring them to Eve. And I would argue that it's interesting that that there's a misunderstanding really about the whole Genesis account, and maybe that's owing to chauvinism in the way that's been taught in the past, or owing into an overreaction of feminism in thinking that like everything's a conspiracy against femininity. So whichever the case it is, the reality is that there has been misunderstanding in terms of the suggestion that Eve created as a helper, and second, makes her somehow lesser in value or secondary, or rather, to be secondary in authority is to be secondary in worth, value, or ability. And that's not at all a biblical concept. In fact, quite to the contrary, I would argue that that Eve is the crowning jewel. She is the one that completes creation. She is the purpose, right, of all of his actions are meant to serve and build her up and hold her up, not in terms of taking leadership roles, because that's what the world thinks is the most important thing, but in the part of playing the part that God has given for both men and women to work together in this complementary fashion. So, I mean, the idea of leadership as the person who gets their way, and headship as the person who gets, to call the shots for their own good, is a worldly and a pagan idea of leadership. But as we've already pointed out, the idea of headship, as demonstrated by Christ, is always sacrifice for the best good of the one that you're leading. So this picture of worldly masculinity and pagan masculinity is really more difficult to scrub out in context than we might initially seem, and realizing that, again, husbands are meant to be sacrificing for and doing what is in the best interest, not necessarily the desires of, but truly the best interests of their wives as best as they understand it. So
now it's interesting to me. Now, this is just an observation that one of the ones I made in reading the text over again, is that Adam named all of the creatures before Eve came along. And I found that kind of interesting, that that's kind of like a kind of a biblical responsibility. And I taught that when you name something, you actually claim authority over it. That God did not tell Adam the name of these things, rather he let Adam name these things. But afterwards, Eve was called the mother of all creation, which basically means, as far as I can tell, now correct me if I'm wrong or if you have any thoughts on this, that Adam shared his authority over creation with his wife. Is that, am I stretching here? Is this kind of the idea? Are you kind of, is this kind of an agreement with you?
Genesis 1:27, I think, very clearly puts that in place, right? I mean, that it's Adam and Eve who were made together in God's image. and they both received the mandate in that regard, like in the theological sense, and then we get the narrative sense
Sure.
in chapter 2.
And that's the thing, right? Because when you deal with this kind of concept of, okay, the man has authority, I go, but I think we missed the point of the entire story if we just leave off with the woman is supposed to kind of just do whatever the man says. I go, nah, that's not exactly what was being touted here. It was that the woman shared the authority that God gave the man, and so therefore, what the two shall become one flesh. If the two are one flesh, then there has to be a shared responsibility, shared authority in that regard. Although I do believe that there is a higher responsibility, not just a higher authority. Authoritatively, you should never be authoritative over your wife because you're one flesh. But when it comes down to the responsibilities of the family, of the responsibilities of the household, or in this regard with Adam creation, that he is the one that is held to the higher standard as far as who's responsible for making decisions. Am I on the right page here? Is that, anybody want to make comments on that? Eric,
Really
you've been quiet for a
appreciate
little while. Okay, go Brad.
I just want to say I
Eric?
appreciated your connection between responsibility and authority, right? And the bigger issue is more so the taking responsibility, right?
Yep.
I mean, it's the sign of weak leadership that always seeks for who did what wrong, let's fix blame, versus being able to sacrificially say it doesn't matter whose fault it was unless we can somehow prevent that in the future. At the moment, I take responsibility for it, even if it was someone disobeying if it was someone under my charge, I take responsibility, right?
Mhm.
And that picture of masculinity, I think, is powerful versus the authoritarian picture that just suggests that, I'm the smartest, I'm the wisest, and I will, if everyone just did it the way I wanted, then everything would go perfect, right? And I think that's where a lot of people, especially Christian men, fall dreadfully short, is they act like, well, I'd be a godly husband if she'd be a godly wife. I'd be a godly father if they'd be godly children. That's not the way it works, you coward, you chicken, you child. Be an adult, be a grown-up. You take responsibility even when it doesn't go your way. And does that mean that you absolve everybody else's failures? No, of course not. You're part of lovingly repairing that as well. But the recognition that this whole I wash my hands of you because you're not doing what I say is absolutely the opposite of what God demonstrates as that picture of caring fatherhood and husbandhood throughout the entire Bible. He doesn't give up on Israel. He disciplines, he interacts with, he takes, in a way, again, we could say he takes responsibility, not saying that her failures are his fault by any stretch of the imagination, but even though they're not his fault, he takes responsibility for them and continues to provide what they need, right? So I think that's an important part of it. And Eric, I'm sorry for cutting in on you.
You didn't cut in. He just asked me a question. I thought silence was a smart thing to do right now.
I don't want to get myself in trouble.
Well, I think we're really good at getting ourselves in trouble, staying in trouble, and passing the buck to others. That's what not biblical manhood. The idea of Adam is a good starting place for men, but Adam was given responsibility by God himself, and therefore he had to be obedient to who? Which sets the pace and demonstrates what should be done is we're answerable to God. Lack of a Hebrew National commercial, but we as biblical men are supposed to answer to a higher authority. And when we so often do, I see in my ministry also, is people want to find a causation and blame it on the causation of their ills instead of just saying, I be the problem, I need to fix me, and I need to be smarter and more godly. And by doing that, I have to grow spiritually and lead my family to where I'm going. I think going back to Jesus's leadership, the amazing thing of a leader that I would get from that is that, sorry, I gotta get a call, guys.
All right. He'll be back. He said so. I want to talk a little bit about that responsibility concept, because when we talk about responsibility over what God has created. Now, there's obviously the mandate, and then the mandate got redacted. It got redacted after the fall. We'll talk about that next week. It also got more redacted after the flood. So there's certain responsibilities what God has, and I think throughout the rest of Scripture, kind of like described in the narrative. I think somewhat prescribed in Proverbs, prescribed in Ecclesiastes, and then obviously I think there's more prescription you find within the epistles and I think you could even find some the kind of the nuance of manhood, masculinity in the Gospels as prescription when Jesus is kind of interacting with the Pharisees and the disciples. We'll get to that when the text gets there. But one of the things that I used to teach a long time ago, and I think it's a godly attribute, that giving responsibility to somebody without giving them the authority is unfair. That if you give somebody responsibility to take care of something, but you say, "Oh, but you don't have any authority," you can't properly perform. We used to whine about that all the time. And when you're middle management, you want me to be responsible for this, but you don't let me to lead these people properly. That's not right. So God sets up a responsibility paradigm, a responsibility tiers. Adam, then as part of him, Eve, and then obviously you got to go down into the responsibilities. And to give Adam responsibility, but say you don't have the final authority, that would be unfair. So we have to be able to recognize, I think, within biblical masculinity, that authority simply means greater responsibility. As pastors, we all understand this, right? That do we have a spiritual authority over what's being taught, over what is allowed in amongst our flock? Yes, and we should have that, and we should enforce that. Like we've talked about various different teachers or books that are really like, "Hey, let's do this study." Absolutely not. That's garbage. Don't read that, right? Or if you're going to read it, make sure you read it with a very astute eye, so as not to get confused over true doctrine. But we can't. But if we're going to have that responsibility of doing so, well, then God has set up within the church certain accountabilities, certain responsibilities, and authorities of elder leadership. Likewise, within a family unit, this is how I like to counsel, is that, listen, we're talking about certain levels of authority, and there should not be a huge gap of authority between husband and wife. However, the buck stops somewhere. And when two people are in charge, no people are in charge. There has to be one that has the final say. I do think that there are times in which the husband follows the wife in certain responsibilities because that's what her responsibility is. We can talk about that when it gets there. But when it comes down to what I believe the biblical mandate demonstrates, now you can go ahead and comment on this, please. And the difference between Adam and Eve is that Adam had a greater responsibility and therefore had to have a greater accountability, a greater authority than Eve. Does everyone kind of agree with that? Kind of.
And I think it's something important to keep here. As long as we're keeping in context, we're not dealing with men and women. We're dealing husband and wife.
True.
That is the paradigm you have in Genesis. And I think, sadly to say, I think the church is somewhat confused on that. They looked at the paradigm that is set for marriage and says, well, that applies to all men and to all women. No, it doesn't. It only applies within your own marital relationship. And for me to superimpose myself into your wife, Will, for example, as her authority is absolute nonsense. It is not biblical. I say that's not my position. And I think men need to be clarified to men with that. But that seems very clear to me in Genesis.
That's a fantastic point, Carl. I think that's something that needs to be reiterated. That I don't have any authority over women in general. That is unfortunately what pastors have thought, it is what people have taught,
Oh.
and it is a I think a destructive concept that all of a sudden a woman on the street, I as a man have authority over. Absolutely not. If the woman is single, who's her authority? She's living on her own. Who's her authority? God.
It's well, it's her,
That
it's
is
her,
God.
it's her father if he's still living. Okay.
I'm saying if she
But
lives
that-
alone, if she's
Yeah,
living alone.
okay, well, yes, ultimately God, inside of a local church, and I would say her pastor does have some
Yes.
different realms of authority, but-
That's the key, though. It's a realm of authority. It's not
Yes,
overall
sir.
authority.
absolutely, it's a realm. I've watched this, I mean, seriously abused when I was pastoring by men. I mean, to the degree that one guy couldn't understand why his wife would not submit when you had her down on the ground and a knife to her throat. You know, you don't understand the biblical mandate, even that case, a husband, wife. So I scribbled something down and I will do that. I was trying to find it. I think I got my internet stabilized, and I apologize to you fellows for that.
That looks good now.
Yeah,
You're doing great.
I had to take a little detour and express some masculinity to someone to get the internet working. I wanted to.
Yeah. You're responsible for it. All right,
Yes.
Carl.
That's right. I am responsible. I am. So I got to the person to correct the issue. But Brad put it well in his notes. When you look where did God create woman from? And he didn't take her out of the head. I'm like you. I'm very close to where you're at. Well, I really see what's inside of marriage. Almost equality, almost between husband and wife. But as you said, someplace when you get somebody has to ultimately be able to make a final decision. And that rests with the husband, but prayerfully, if he is a godly man, his leadership should cause his wife or cause his wife to desire to want to follow in that situation. And I'm in right now 58 years. And I can tell you, I got another 4 or 5 days to be 58 years. There's never 58 years time that I've had made an arbitrary decision to my wife, absolutely not. This is what we're doing. I've never had to do that. And if I had to, then my leadership failed somewhere. I would then come back to me and say, that lays something with you. It was the same to me when hiring employees. And I think if I had to let somebody go, then I failed someplace in the interview process. There's something I didn't catch that I didn't pick up. That was my responsibility to hire somebody who had the ability and then give them the tools they needed to function. And I think as men, we have to be willing to accept that in our relationship, in our marriage. If our wife isn't following, then we're doing something wrong. Okay. I would look at self first. That's the first place I'm going to look.
I want to echo that because, a lot of times I tell people within a marriage, you should always strive for consensus. That if the decision doesn't need to be made right now, like, and it's like an emergency situation but if everything can usually wait so that you become to a consensus. But if you can't come to a consensus, then the buck stops with the husband. That's usually how I consult. But I agree with you. I think that's something I'm going to incorporate, Carl, when it comes down to the husband-wife relationship. If consensus cannot be reached, what did the husband do wrong? Where did you fail? Go ahead, Brad.
I think we also have to at least make recognition of, because I think that at some level there is a subtle indication that if we just led perfectly, they would just follow perfectly, kind of a deal. And the reality is that obviously the wife could also be in sin, right? The wife could also be, rejecting not just the husband's authority, but the Lord's, right? That'd be the real problem. And I think that's another important part. I think that's why, right? The Bible is, just again, the whole Old Testament, God's interaction with Israel is constantly a sinful group of people responding negatively to perfect leadership. So we have to allow for that possibility as well, you know, and within the context that a godly man does not need a perfect wife, you know, who follows. And so, well, I think I want to echo and agree Carl's point that we are meant to be looking to ourselves, not, you know, trying to nitpick and correct the other person, because that's the part we can handle. And that's where we'll get the best results as well, if we want to talk about the pure results of it. But at the same time, just that realization that there is a situation, right, where unprovoked, we might say, just as a husband can fail in his part of the equation, unprovoked by the wife, he can't blame her for his failures, so she can't blame him for hers, right? Because her job as a godly and biblical wife is no more contingent upon his leadership than his is upon her followership. So I think that I don't want to take anything away from this this excellent discussion of self-examination and taking responsibility, but I also don't want to, you know, give that wrong idea that, oh, well, if you just led her better, if you just led the kids better, then they wouldn't have walked. If you just, and I would believe that in fact, I know for a fact, I've seen many godly fathers, many godly mothers doing their best, and the kids still walked away anyway, you know, and I don't know what happened beyond closed doors.
You have, and let's get ahead of us a bit, but I think Genesis 3:16 indicates to me that a woman does not really like that. And we'll wait till we'll get there, but there's some wording there that makes it clear to me that, and I guess I can understand it, because I don't particularly like being in that position. But there is because of the fall, there is an innate resistance to that leadership. I think it's clear.
And there's an innate desire not to lead amongst men.
Well, I'd like to get back before I interrupted myself. This all takes me back to where I was leading in this leading question about how to lead.
Yes.
I think men leading has to go. They have to know where they're going. They have to have a direction. They have to not announce it necessarily, but it's got to be known what their direction is. Whatever phase of life we're talking about, to lead is one thing, and people have to say, I'm going to follow this person, dad, husband, however you want to look at him, boss, because I know he's going in a direction I'd like to arrive at some point in my life. But just like everything in life, there's two sides. I can tell. I'm going to pick on Brad because he's on my screen. I can pick on Brad. I can say, Brad, I'm going to tell you the truth, and the truth is truth, maybe. Let's just, for instance, say, hypothetically, I will tell him the exact truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. And Brad says, nah. So truth has to have a reception to it, just like leadership. You could say, this guy's a great leader, and he's going to a place this family should go, but little Beth doesn't want to do it. She's going to be an ingrat, and she's going to do her own thing, and dad's doing his best, and mom's doing her best to lead. There is still two sides of leadership. But we're talking about biblical masculinity, and this should be a path that the man should choose, not because he wants the biblical results. He wants to be the biblical man. The results of that leadership still lies on the recipients. So we're talking about two different things sometimes. I think we got to make sure we're talking about how a man should be a man biblically. And it's not dependent on the results. I think what happens if we do things dependent on the results, we're going to be madmen, not masculine men. It's going to be maddening. I'll just give you for instance, real quick. I've coached baseball for a long time. I think I'm pretty good at it. And I look at some of the results. I got some really cruddy players and really great players on different levels. And neither one really is a result of my leadership and my coaching. It's how they received it and what they decided to do with it, and that kind of idea. So same thing when it comes to biblical masculinity. I think there's certain things we have to be as godly men, leaders. We have to be biblical. We have to be loving. We've got to be sacrificial. We've got to learn to put others first, and we got to remain in the Word of God. There's other things involved, but I think those are the basics. So, but other people have to respond, and that our masculinity will support us when we say, I didn't fail with that child failed God, or whatever the situation may be. Jacob had your hand up, so I'm going to pass the baton to you.
Yeah, I think just as we talk about leadership and its similarities and contrasts with biblical masculinity, I was thinking too, while the man is called to be the head of the home, I think we have to be somewhat cautious with developing a principle of what leadership is and cookie cutter every man must meet that. Because, you know, I guess what I was thinking of is men are different. You know, we have different personalities, different makeup, and, you know, leadership will look different, but it's still a responsibility. And so I think that's another factor that I think was somewhat alluded to by Eric, but I just wanted to share my thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's a very important factor that we're all different. We're different individuals. What could constitute leadership in one home to somebody else might look like a failure. See, in my home, I handle all the finances. I've got the background for that, so that's easy. My wife, I make a budget. My wife gets input with the budget, and so we're there. Somebody else's home, the wife might have that. The husband might have delegated that to his wife because she is far better with dealing with that. So you do have to. There is not a cookie cutter. I don't think at all. And I take your point, and Eric's well taken. And I really do like, Eric, the fact, as you said, I can only be responsible to lead. I cannot be responsible for how somebody responds.
Yes. And so I think based upon our previous comments, then it might be better to say if something fails, if we can't come to consensus, then a male, the husband should be introspective. Did I do something wrong? Not necessarily I am doing something wrong. So, you know, kind of like, but you don't, the initial concept, usually within our own pride, is to immediately place blame on the other individual. You're not following correctly, or, you know, you're not understanding me. You know, that's often when you're getting into an argument, usually the statement is, you're not understanding me. Well, maybe you're not communicating it well. And so there needs to be first an introspective, I think. Am I doing something wrong? Am I not displaying this information correctly? Am I not leading correctly? What's going on? But then also have the emotional courage, the fortitude to be able to also hold the other person responsible. To say, right now you're being unreasonable. I think I've looked at this, I've reconsidered it, but I think you're being unreasonable in this particular area, and here's why. And at times, I think if we've done correctly, the wife will often appreciate the introspective and then the confrontation if necessary.
I think I would add to that, perhaps we should be introspective regardless of failure or success. In fact, maybe even more so upon success. What worked? You know, what led to these types of results, and give commendation to those who deserve it. I think that's another mark of things we see in Christ. You know, he was quick to give praise to people who were praiseworthy, and he was also quick to rebuke those who needed rebuked. And that's kind of getting to what Brad said earlier. That's one of the hardest parts, especially for me, being raised amongst a lot of conflict. I have a major degree in conflict avoidance. And so, but there's times where we have to, because it's going to protect someone else or a group of people or whatever.
Jacob, for what this worth, this is something that I guess probably more from business practice, but I do bring it brought in my home. I could care less about fixing blame. I care about fixing the problem. And that's really all I care about. Let's fix the problem. What does it take to fix the problem? That may take some giving on my part or some misunderstanding, or it may take some issues on somebody else's part. But I have found that is maybe particularly if you, I don't mind conflict, okay? I'll be just straight up about that. This just probably comes from one being the oldest. I think some of your positions in your family is a man. influences the way you lead and the way we do things. So conflict has never bothered me, because to me, I see a resolution to the problem. But if you can approach something with that, I'm not here to fix blame on anybody. I really don't care. I want to fix the problem. What do we got to do? And oftentimes, then when you get to when you can get to focus the problem, then the problems within the individuals can come out and can be resolved, and that might help in some of those situations. For what 2 cents it's worth, my friend.
Very good. Drew, would you like to add anything? We haven't heard from you for a little bit.
I love the conversation. I've been just following along, and I think of the Ephesians passage that says, submit yourselves one to another. Okay, that's right before wives, submit yourself to your own husband, and husband, love your wife. And that's a passage often gets left out, but that is in a relational passage, primarily a marriage. And I know a lot of you guys, when you talk about marriage counseling, I don't know how many men have come in and said, I just want to know who's the boss in this family. And I just say, well, the Lord wants to know who's the servant. So
nice.
that's my response. But you know what Carl is saying, I love that, because I was just sitting here thinking, to fix blame and find somebody sounds like the way the government functions. They said it, a good scapegoat's often as good as the solution, you know, and that's not the way we should be. We need to be different. And the difference is set by the Lord in his word. And so, you know, I see what you've said, a balance that is in there where you take the input, but there does come times when somebody's got to make the decision. You can't kick the can down the road anymore. And I think that falls to the man. And so, you know, that's, so I like I say, I love the conversation. There's a lot of good stuff coming out of this.
In my notes that I've been writing down, as far as kind of like listening to you all speak and kind of getting some ideas, I have a question here. How does God differentiate between Adam and Eve? And from what I've been able to write down, and I would like to see if there's anything you'd like to add or expand upon this. There's biological difference. We all know that. The world pretends that didn't exist, but it's very true. There's a difference between the soul, perspectives, how we think. There's a difference in responsibility. There's a difference in authority, but that authority also always follows God. There's a difference in family roles. I think we can begin to, although it's not fully expanded upon, but begins to be understood within the Genesis creation account. And there's also a difference within the leadership, because authority without leadership is unfair. Is there anything you would like to add to that? I'm actually quite amazed over how much information we're able to get concerning masculinity simply from the first 2 chapters. I thought it would be a lot less, to be honest with you, but I found this to be very refreshing and amazing. But is there anything else you'd like to add to that, expand upon before we close? All right. Well, this comes to an end to our second hour of round the table discussions concerning the role of masculinity, biblical masculinity and specifics. Next time we meet, we'll be talking about Genesis chapter 3 and the impact the fall had upon masculinity. And I think that's a very important discussion, because God made everything good and there was supposed to be a definitive role. We broke something. And how did that impact masculinity? How did that impact family roles? And so we'll be having that discussion next week. For now, thank you all, gentlemen, very much. I appreciate you coming on, having this conversation. Thank you, Brad, for giving us the groundwork and the foundation for to be able to have this discussion. And above all, we want to give glory and honor to God and our Father, our leader, you know, and giving us this opportunity to be able to express these things openly. All right. We'll see you all next time.